So just to introduce myself, I'm Clive Thomas. I work as an advisor in the Soil Association, leading on what we call our regenerative forestry agenda. And my job today is to, first of all, introduce the format for this session, introduce the speakers, and move us along. But before I do any of that, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes saying why we were so keen to run this session specifically focused on farm woodland at Groundswell. Now, I think many of you will be aware of the kind of energy and the interest and the growing awareness amongst the farming community around agroforestry and integrating trees into farming systems, and that's fantastic. And there's been some great sessions at this festival this year already on that topic. And in previous years as well, and it does genuinely feel like there's some real momentum, I think, in terms of agroforestry and that integration. But what we wanted to do was come back to an issue, I think, that's been there for a while, which is the existing tree resource that is on most farms across the UK. And I've just put on the screen the screenshot from a report that we produced last year called Regenerative Forestry. Now, we highlighted quite a few things in this report, but one of the things that we did pick up on strongly was the fact that of the approximately 3.2 million hectares of woodland that there is in the UK, according to agricultural censuses and reported in forestry statistics, more than 1 million hectares of that is on agricultural holdings. Now, for us, that offers a fantastic opportunity, which is what we're going to focus on in this session, but also a big risk, I think, that if we don't, I guess, integrate our thinking around where we're going with trees on farms and trees in farming systems with that woodland resource, then we may miss some opportunities and we may miss some of those integration opportunities. A few other sort of salient points that will set the scene for that woodland resource. A large proportion of it, it does cover a very wide spectrum from sort of estate woodland through to very small farm woodlands. But the vast majority of it, particularly at the smaller end of it, is what we would sort of acknowledge as undermanaged or unmanaged. Not just from the sense of productivity from it for farmers and for the wider rural economy, but also from a biodiversity perspective. The woodland condition, actually generally of our woodlands in the UK, isn't great. I think only 1% of our planted forests are in good ecological condition, and the vast majority of farm woodland fits into that category. So we really wanted to sort of profile this morning, and just, you know, I've put up this slide that I think we all know that trees in the farm landscape operate along a spectrum. So you've got perhaps just incidental trees, you've got those sorts of trees in the landscape. Then you may have your more deliberate or remnant agroforestry systems, and then at the other end of the scale you tend to have large scale forests that are often not owned or managed by farmers. But the bit that we really want to focus on in this session is that bit on farm, that farm woodland resource, and explore some of those opportunities. So we're going to hopefully have a sort of optimistic session, but we are going to acknowledge the barriers along the way. We need to be really realistic about this. Okay, so to help us with that, as I said, we've got three fantastic speakers. So we've got Tim from Bangor University, and Tim and I are going to have a bit of a conversation to give Tim the opportunity to give us some of his insights, maybe from a more academic but hopefully sort of grounded, practical focused academic perspective on this opportunity and the sort of wider resource and the barriers. And then Tim's going to be followed by Tom from the Woodland Trust, who's going to focus on some of the work they've been doing to support farmers to manage their woodlands. And then finally we'll hear from Ollie from the Land Workers Alliance, who similarly has been pulling together some case studies in a fantastic report that his organisation published a few months ago called The Cutting Edge. But we do want to hear from all of you as well. So we plan to finish with at least 15 minutes to spare, so that you can engage with us, ask us questions, or just make observations. So that's the plan. Okay, so Tim, let's start by perhaps hearing from your side, your sort of particular perspective really on the sort of productivity opportunities and benefits that could be explored from our farm woodland resource.
Okay, good morning. I've been working with agroforestry and farm woodlands for 20 years now. A lot in the UK, but a lot overseas as well. Um, Yesterday I was wandering around, and I hear a lot about stacking. Was a word that I came across quite frequently in the tents that I was visiting, and this idea that we need to think about the sort of benefits that we can deliver across farms. And I think farm woodlands are a really interesting place for us to start thinking about that, not least because that's an area on the farm where a lot of these benefits are currently being delivered. Farm woodlands are capable of doing a wide range of things which we don't necessarily recognize or acknowledge. And I say we, as researchers, we definitely probably do not put enough energy into understanding the value of farm woodlands, and as a result, sometimes policy ignores these areas. But these are acting actively as, air conditioning units for our farms. There are carbon factories. They're providing a broad range of both on-farm and off-farm benefits. Many of these are remnant features on the farm, so they've been there for a long period of time, so not necessarily in our day-to-day top agenda, but nonetheless at key points in the year they're providing definite benefits to the farm. But as Clive has said, I think that the key thing here is that not only are they under-recognised, but they're largely under-managed. So whilst they have huge potential to deliver a range of things, we're tending not to utilise that resource to its full extent.
Tim, would you like to just give us some perhaps examples from your perspective of maybe both sort of on-farm but also off-farm opportunities, maybe focusing on some of the agroecological benefits that may be still relevant from farm woodlands?
Yeah, I mean, so just we need to be careful because farm woodlands cover a wide range of different things. So we're talking about anything, from quite small woodland parcels up to reasonable size areas. So from an agroecological point of view, particularly for livestock, farm woodlands have potentially really important role for shelter provision on farm, and in parts of the world you can see woodlands being increasingly used as sort of living barns for livestock, particularly now as we go through these very hot summers, or as part of the shelter infrastructure on farm during the sort of wet seasons. Obviously, depending on where the farm is situated, they will have quite a major role to play in managing the water coming off farm, and by managing the microclimate on farm as well, which contributes to the shelter, and also the way that the water moves through the farm. They're very important. There's a whole host of things that trees are doing generally on the farm that, and if you watch your livestock's behaviour at certain times of the year, particularly on arable and pastoral systems, you'll see them utilising that resource. And of course, some of our farming systems have integrated woodland directly into their practice.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Now, one of the sort of things that I think often gets levelled quite appropriately in many ways about farm woodlands is the challenges of scale, and the fact that like some of the sort of, I guess, aspects of our food system, that we haven't necessarily got the sort of wider infrastructure to help us manage what is often quite a small scale resource distributed across the landscape. So they quite often get characterized as unviable, non-commercial. That's the sort of language that we hear. But that feels to me like quite a slippery term, and that we really need to maybe sort of unpack a little bit what we mean by viability, particularly when we think about it as at a farm level, and in terms of the sort of ability perhaps for woodland to support the wider farm enterprises, or to be a farm enterprise in its own right. So Tim, I know I've often heard you talk about the sort of ideas of risk and resilience and diversification. So any insights that you'd like to give us on that?
Yeah, I guess I think it's. I mean, with all of these things, we need to recognise that so we're sort of moving across a time spectrum. So, we don't have to go back that far in our history to see us actively managing our woodlands on farms. Really, I guess going back to sort of pre-World War One, we would have been actively managing our farms for resources and utilising those resources on our farms. We've had quite a significant change to agriculture since in that post-war period, and as a result, that resource has been deprioritised, I suspect, because we've found, and we've got globalised systems. We're looking forward now into a future where we're getting increasing uncertainty around our supply chains. We've got climate change obviously starting to bite. We've seen that this summer. It's nice to see some rain today. So things are changing, and I think that's a really important thing for us to be doing. We have a resource now, a potential resource here, which going forward into the future, going into this uncertainty with these increased stresses around, looking at the potential, bringing some of this resource back into management, seeing it as an opportunity for us to, diversification is an obvious aspect of farm woodlands that we can think about. If we can start to produce a high quality resource within those woodlands, then that's another potential income stream into the woodland. If we can improve the management of those woodlands in any way, you can start to optimize around the different types of benefits those can provide on farm. And I think it's, to talk about a sort of cliche, we always talk about planting trees, and the right time to plant trees was 20 years ago, and the second best time is to plant them now. And I think the same sort of applies to the management of our woodlands. It would have been great if we could have started bringing our woodlands into management 20 years ago, but we also run a risk. What we're seeing around us in terms of tree health means that this resource base could and is actively degrading. And sometimes it's a case of not knowing what we've got until it's gone, and really don't want to get into that situation. I think the other thing to note is that farm woodland has been expanding across the UK for a number of years, and there's absolutely no doubt that all new woodland in the UK will be farm woodland. That's where it's going to occur. And so bringing that, bring some aspects of silviculture into our farm management, our farm woodland management, potentially offers us a chance to protect and actively benefit from that resource.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we link through to the sort of concept really of farm scale forestry, and there has been these waves of encouraging farmers to plant trees over the last 100 years, and it has been reasonably successful. But the bit that's been perhaps less successful is the growing of those trees to support the farm enterprise or to develop new enterprises. And I think we didn't want to make this a particularly sort of policy focused session, and we're going to get very practical in a moment when we hear from Tom and Ollie. But I think we do need to sort of acknowledge that fact that whether accidentally or deliberately, we've gone down a particular sort of model of forestry in the UK that's primarily the model that produces our timber. But that's not necessarily the future. It doesn't have to be like that in the future. There was a sort of choice or non-choices made that we were going to effectively sort of deprioritise farm-scale forestry. But that's not necessarily the case in all countries, and maybe that's the point that we want to explore next, really. What can we learn from sort of an international experience? How is this done in other parts of the world? And Tim, again, I know that you've done a little bit of research on this.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go too far. I mean, just across the channel into France, and you can see, certainly my father-in-law has a piece of land in southern France, and pretty typically across that area you'll see roughly a fifth of the land on any of those farms is going to be productive woodland that is actively managed. Okay, now that isn't a uniform picture across France, and it's certainly not necessarily a healthy picture at the particular moment in time. Similar to what's happened here, we've started to see quite a lot of closures of small sawmills, which are really critical to be able to utilise that resource. But we can also see areas of Brittany now. Farmers are starting to revisit their farm woodland systems, and the bocage areas sort of are being, there's a big push to bring those back into management, and this is partly to do to a cultural value around those woodlands as traditionally, and I guess the big difference in France to here is that up until very, very recently, the fuel resource on those farms was what was heating those farms, and so the management of that woodland was integral to the function of the farm and the resource. And I think that's an important element, Clive, is to think about how you bring value to the farm. I think you can look further afield. So I've got colleagues working in Oregon, in the States. There's quite a large, big push there to see to work with the woodland resource farms that are fairly similar to what we have here. A lot of interest there around both the productive function of those woodlands and again, as I was talking about, using them as living barns for stock, which, you know, any form of management is starting to realize additional value around that area. The gentleman in this picture is a guy called Rowan Reed. He's in Australia there. Rowan's a pretty interesting guy. You can find him on LinkedIn pretty easily. Rowan is excellent at farm silviculture, and really preaches a need for us to really look at and realize this huge value from what he really focuses on is producing high quality, high value timber on his farm, and has modified the sort of silvicultural models that he uses to be able to work within farming systems. So, I mean, he's well worth having a look at. I guess the last thing I'd say about learning things from our neighbours is, obviously, in many senses here in the UK, we're completely dependent on our neighbours. So we're getting a huge amount of our hardwood from France, and that comes to us at quite a cost. And that cost isn't just financial, it's a carbon cost to us. And when we think about our million hectares here, the fact that we're not utilising that resource ourselves is, as you mentioned, a huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure many of you are aware, but that is one of the paradoxes, I think, in UK forestry generally, is that we have this large undermanaged, underutilised resource, and yet at the same time we import most of our timber, so 80% plus of our timber. And in any other sort of market situation, that would definitely signify an opportunity. But we're going to go on to sort of acknowledge some of the barriers at the moment, in a moment, and hopefully, as I say, be optimistic when we hear from Tom and Ollie about some of the solutions that are out there. Just a final point on Rowan Reed. I would, like Tim said, would encourage you to follow him on LinkedIn if you're not doing so already. I mean, what I've really learnt from the way he thinks about his trees is that it's very similar to the way perhaps a livestock farmer thinks about their livestock. So he knows them individually, he monitors them, he looks after them, and you know, that's the way to add value. We know that from a livestock system, and he's demonstrating it from a timber growing perspective. So it is possible. So yeah, Tim, what about addressing some of the barriers? You know, that this issue that the resource itself isn't in a great condition currently, with some sort of notable exceptions. We've obviously got the scale issue to think about, but yeah, are you optimistic on that?
Optimistic. I think what's important really is that we have this conversation, and the conversation can't just be with farmers as usual. It's got to be with, I've recently been having a very similar conversation with the forestry sector, and it's a really important conversation to have, I think, is that to get this to really work, it's about lots of people coming together, actually. I would hope at this sort of event where we've got people who are open-minded about the resource and are looking for ways to add value to the farm, that we can start that process. Some of you may already be actively managing the woodlands on your farms, but we need to look at the supply chain, we need to look at our timber mills, and that's going to require other actors becoming more engaged. Now, I think the forestry sector is alert to it. I'd like to think they are to this, but we have some infrastructural issues around being able to realize value in a way that we would like from this resource. There's the issue of scale, the fact that the actual resource base itself is very different across the 4 countries of the UK. So currently about half of our farm woodlands are in Scotland. I think about 30% are in England, then it goes down to about 11 in Wales and 2% in Northern Ireland. So that resource base is very different depending on where you are in the UK. Of course, a lot of it will be in areas that are hard to access. So there may be, if we look at what's happening in places outside of the UK, the technological advances in the way that we manage our resource allows us perhaps access timber in a way that we would still struggle to do so in the UK at the moment. So bringing some of that resource to market is challenging.
Thanks, Tim. I think we're going to leave our particular conversation there, but thanks for those insights. And now going to move on to Tom. Tom works for the Woodland Trust as an outreach manager in South East England, and has had the opportunity to, address, or maybe realise some of these opportunities, but address some of these barriers as well. So, Tom, would you like to take us through your presentation?
Thank you, Clive, for that introduction, and thanks for asking the Trust to speak today. It's much appreciated. So I was going to speak today about the ways that the Woodland Trust advice can help unlock farm woodland assets. We're focusing mainly on ancient woodland restoration, but I think it is applicable to other woodland types as well. My viewpoint is that this can be done through two methods, either the reduction or removal of internal costs on the farm. This could be wood chip for cattle bedding, biomass for on-site energy production, fencing material, or as we've heard, shelter, shade and fodder for animals, and potentially building materials as well. But then there can be the opportunity to generate a new farm business or new farm product from woodlands on farms. Here I just thought I'd take the opportunity to run through the wide range of different forest products that can be generated on farms. So we've got the basic sort of wood chip, we've got bar and saw logs, we've got again saw logs here that can generate sawn timber, and this sawn timber can then be converted into on-site products or off-site products as well. This is a timber frame barn that was built out of larch, again low grade material, it wasn't high grade, so it's really nice to see this timber being used and the carbon being locked up in this sort of way. And this can be through on-site conversion. And then this is a unique opportunity here, so it's looking for those other additional ways. These are logs that were hand peeled and taken to Kew Gardens to be used in their children's playground. This is a play tree being loaded on the lorry, again going to Kew Gardens to be used in their children's forest playground. Here again, sweet chestnut lahs being used as a material to restore a historical building. General signage, again sculpture, landscape scale engagement with people, basic wildlife boxes, beehives, quite a range there. So here are some real life examples where the Trust have undertaken ancient woodland restoration surveys and reports for landowners. Through this survey we generate a threats and features map, so we identify all of those ancient woodland features across the site, zone the woodland, and then identify potential threats. We then gauge these threats as critical or threatened across the site. You can see here that there are no secured areas of this ancient woodland, and then we prioritise those areas for the landowner to action to remove the threats from the most threatened areas. This report then stimulated a restoration programme of thinning works within the dense dark western hemlock that was contained on this site. So here you can see an ancient woodland feature surrounded by western hemlock, deep in shade. Again, deep shade above the ancient woodland ground flora here, and then you can see through our advice and support the woodland's been thinned, the light has increased, and the ground flora has been released. Again, a picture of a well-thinned western hemlock woodland there. And through this thinning programme, they then use the material to develop a new on-site farm enterprise where they use their own material to here they're using it to create and build a field shelter with material that would be low grade, that may not have gone for saw logs. It may have just all been wrapped up and gone as chip, but they've taken the opportunity to add value to this thinning operation that has really been supported through our advice, and our advice has actually led to a higher volume being taken off from the woodland, because the farmer had the confidence to actually do that. And from our point of view, it's then releasing and removing the threats to this ancient woodland site. The second example here is restoration through coppicing. So again, ancient woodland restoration survey and report was carried out. This generated this features and threats map. Here there was a lot of rhododendron, unthinned Norway spruce, and the site had very poor access for the removal of timber products. So here is an example of that dense shade generated by the overstood sweet chestnut coppice and the rhododendron. Rhododendron shading out and crowding the Norway spruce plantation. This is an example post the removal of the rhododendron, so you can see the increased level of light there and the ability for the woodland to regenerate. They were able to start a coppicing regime again because the rhododendron had been removed, so therefore it made it more economical for them to go in and undertake the coppicing work. Here you can see that the coppice regenerating. Again, for us it's increasing that biodiversity, it's restoring the ancient woodlands. And here are some of the forest products that were generated from that new fencing enterprise that was using the sweet chestnut coppice on site and then selling it to third parties off site. Thank you, Clive.
Thanks, Tom. Just seen a few examples there from Tom. I think this opportunity of on-farm use of timber grown on farm is definitely underexplored. I don't have any kind of hard figures and facts to kind of confirm this, but I think anecdotally we know that farmers are spending a lot of money on timber. They're buying in timber from off-farm sources for their on-farm needs. So just those very practical examples of being able to convert your timber and use it even just for your basic fencing needs, there has to be more opportunity to do that, and as your example showed, Tom, bring that woodland into condition and have a crop again in the future, particularly if it's a coppice crop. So thanks for that, Tom. Okay, Ollie, tell us about your little bit about your fantastic report, The Cutting Edge, and some of the case studies that you profile in the report, and more generally, really, I think your take on what we're talking about here and this opportunity. So over to you, Ollie.
Okay, thanks very much, Clive. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ollie Rodker. I work with the forestry members of the Land Workers Alliance, which is a union of farmers and foresters. We have 200 or 300 practicing foresters in our membership. One of our key principles when we set up was that we would try and be a union for both farmers and foresters, because we wanted to see an end to the existing divide such as it is between farming and forestry, and we wanted those people to work together much more effectively. We've recently produced a report. It's called The Cutting Edge. There's a few copies down here at the front for anyone who wants to take one away in hard copy, or available on our website. I should go on to my own slide. I want to come at this from a slightly different angle. I mean, totally agree with everything that's just gone before. We wanted to come at this from the showing the opportunities and the existing examples of employment on small-scale forestry and the regenerative, sustainable forestry that our members were working on. There's very little visibility of the brilliant work that some people are doing around the country and the forestry employment opportunities there are, and this report hopefully is about profiling a few of them and bringing out some of the themes and some of the policy issues that arise from their work. There are 12 case studies in that report. I'm just going to pick on 3 just to bring out a couple of points in this very little talk. But it points in various directions in terms of the things that we need to do. And we certainly take the view that, you know, with probably 2.5 million acres of woodland in this country, there is a huge opportunity, and it's crazy that in this time we're not making better use of the opportunities that we have in our own country, and we have to work out the ways to make that happen. We're very eager to work with all sorts of people to try and find solutions there. The first example I bring out is Dave in Devon at Middle Ruckham Farm and Forestry. He took on a 10-hectare derelict sort of ex-plantation, really. It had been planted in the 1960s. It was on the farm. It was part of the farm, but it had been derelict for 30 or 40 years. A softwood plantation. He now his main income comes now from working that forest. He takes out about 30 trees a year and turns them into small sheds and buildings with a sort of a share in the on-site mobile sawmill that is there in the picture. With those 30 trees, he's making a turnover of about 70 grand by adding value to those trees that he's taking out. So I'll say this again for the couple of other ones. The point is, you don't need a huge expanse of forest, a huge expanse of trees to make an income out of it. There may be a job opportunity there. Not every piece of woodland and every piece of forest is going to be suitable for that kind of thing, but those opportunities are definitely there. I'll skip over Cornwall, actually, Working Woodlands Cornwall, who are doing brilliant work, but just for time. This is Alistair Hayhurst. He's in Derbyshire. He's a coppicer. His business is called Underwood Crafts. He's someone who's keeping rural skills alive in Derbyshire, working what bits of remnant coppice there are around, turning that into hurdles, chairs, landscape features, working with schools, doing all sorts of different landscape work. He's sort of over the last few years has cobbled together that business out of about 4 or 5 acres of areas of coppice on different farms. He doesn't own any of his own woodland. He's a sort of he has a yard, but he's an itinerant woodsman working different pieces of coppice in a rotation, bringing some of those woods on farms back into management, improving the diversity and the ecology there, because he's in there restoring the rotation of coppice and making a business out of it. And, you know, we have a lot of members in Landworks Alliance or people who contact us who, you know, who are looking for this kind of opportunity. If you have, you know, even as little as 4 or 5 acres of coppice on your land, on your farm, that could be rejuvenated, that could be rescued, then there could be a job opportunity there for somebody. Leeds Coppice Workers are a cooperative of 8 people, surprisingly, in the Leeds area. They are unusual in that I guess they're a peri-urban business, so they work right in small patches of woodlands in Leeds and in the surrounding area. Sort of Leeds as an area actually includes quite a bit of Yorkshire, so they work quite a way out of Leeds as well. But again, over the last 10 years, they have put together a sort of portfolio of working on different woodlands, some very small areas, some publicly owned woodland, a mixture of farms, small patches here, parts of woodlands that they have sort of carved out of other larger derelict patches of woodland. And they've got a business there selling coppice products and poles all around the country. In fact, they sell things too, because with the range of the woodlands that they can access, they can create a range of products very easily. They know all those different woods well. They can source a lot of different kinds of things, so they're responsive to different people's needs. So again, that's 8 people. Some of them are part-time. You know, it's low paid. They're not making a huge income, but they're really happy that they are rejuvenating the landscape in an urban area, and that they're producing a thing that a lot of people are wanting to get locally rather than being shipped in internationally. As we heard, there's a lot of issues here with us bringing in timber from around the world. Some closer from France, some from around the world, that we really do have already growing here. So out of out of these sort of 12 case studies, there's, I guess, some sort of key themes emerged, and there's a little bit more information in the report, so I'll only just touch on it now in these slides. The benefits of an integrated approach is that these are working examples where these woodlands have been made both productive and ecologically improved. So there's been a historical divide where production in forestry has tended to come from one type of woodland, and the conservation and the ecology has concentrated on other kinds of woodland. And there's a lot of benefits from looking at ways that we can do those from the same piece of land, from the same bit of woodland. That can take time, depending on the state of the woodland and the state of the trees and the state of the biodiversity, but that is definitely possible, and that's definitely the way that we think things need to go. We can't separate out these kinds of uses in the way that we have done. We've got to be a lot more integrated. A lot of these businesses are dependent to some degree on firewood, and there's a whole discussion there around firewood and biomass and energy, and I won't go into it right now, but it's really that production of firewood is really important in the early stages of establishing these kinds of sustainable businesses, because it's as you get these woods and these forests back into rotation and back into a management, there's a lot of trees and biomass and timber there that is not productive in the early stages, and that is what can go for firewood and be a useful income in terms of setting up businesses. And thirdly was a sort of repeated theme about how people producing timber products, and we saw a great load of slides, and we saw a whole load of them just previously, how they're having to struggle on price to compete with the global supply. And of course that's no surprise, the same thing is happening in the food system, but in the longer run there's going to have to be some sort of process that allows people in this country to produce from our own woods in a way that supports their business without being undercut by timber that's coming in from much less well-managed woodlands much further afield with all sorts of the costs, and that's a political issue that we're going to have to take on in some way together. The main barriers that people talked about, firstly and most strongly, is the need for affordable housing, and this is again obviously a widespread rural issue. Across the country in rural areas there's a lack of affordable housing, and for people, particularly frustrating for a lot of people working in woods who would love to build themselves their own home out of a material that would be sequestering carbon right there, only 10 meters away from where they could live and where they could manage their woods, and they're not allowed to because of the planning regulations in this country. The need for a more supportive grant and loan system to support this kind of sustainable and regenerative forestry, and the difficulties of accessing land, of finding people who understand the issues around getting woodlands into rotation, the time that takes, the energy that you have to put in at the beginning, but the longer term outputs that are possible. And that's largely an educational and a cultural thing, and hopefully everybody here can be part of that spreading out of that understanding, and that growth in knowledge about the possibilities there. There are 10 policy recommendations, very broad policy recommendations at the end of the report, but we probably haven't got time to go into those. But we can do if people want to ask about it. Otherwise, I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks to Tim and Tom as well for their great presentations and their insights. I mean, just to pick up on a couple of themes that Ollie left us with there, and to kind of bring it back to where we started, this sort of integration point. As I said earlier, one of the reasons we're so keen to run this session is to make sure that this opportunity of farm woodland kind of maybe gets caught up a little bit in some of the momentum that there is around agroforestry and the integration of trees on farms, because there's definitely opportunities there to think through some of these barriers in that sort of more collective, integrated way. And also brilliant to bring in the livelihoods point. People are crucial to this, and there are jobs in this, and there is the ability to make a living from this. So good to hear those insights. So thanks for that, Ollie. Okay, we have about just over 15 minutes now for any observations or questions from any of you. So we've got this gentleman with his hand up here. First of all, thank you. Just to let you know, we can't really see you because we've got kind of lights shining in our eyes, but we can just about see hands.
Hi, I'm a farmer. It's estimated there's going to be 150 million ash trees dying in the next 10 years, 20% of all of our cover. How can we integrate that death of ash and all that wood into schemes going forward?
Yeah, I'll bring in probably all of the panelists in a moment on that one, but yeah, I mean that is obviously a serious concern. It's not least for a very important tree in our farm landscapes and a very important tree from a timber perspective. Is obviously suffering from ash dieback at the moment. I think the science is still developing in terms of whether we will lose all the ash from our landscape, but there's no doubt about it. There's a lot of diseased ash at the moment that needs to be dealt with. I mean, I think from where my thinking's gone on that is that is part of the opportunity. I think obviously there's a downside to it in the longer run in terms of that particular species, but because that point you've just made is so well acknowledged, and the sort of forestry authorities and the sort of wider agencies operating kind of understand that point, that does create some opportunities in terms of support to actually get in and deal with the ash issue, but maybe deal with other issues as well in terms of bringing the wider woodland into management. But well, maybe Tom and Ollie, from your sort of practical point of view, have you did that come up as much of a theme, Ollie, when you did the case studies, for instance, on ash?
Sorry. Not actually particularly, because I guess maybe through partly chance, most of the people I talk to are not particularly sort of working with ash. I mean, there's a lot of firewood coming out of ash, certainly, and it's supporting a lot of businesses. But that's not the only thing that ash timber is good for. I mean, there's a big conversation that we could have around the state of disease, and a lot of trees are stressed in this country at the moment. And I think there's going to be other tree diseases coming in because of the combination of spreading pests and climate and drought stress and other things. So, that is very worrying, and it's tragic. I mean, it's a tragic situation. As Clive said, it's an opportunity to look at more diverse plantings to take their place, and I think to really look at species that have potential that will be good for biodiversity, but also productive in the long run. And there's a few examples, yeah, I guess a lot of people that we looked at in this report are using timber for building and sort of outdoor landscape features, and ash doesn't tend to be the most useful tree from those points of view. So I mean, yeah, first and foremost, it's a tragedy. And there's not an immediate it's complicated, I think, what we do with that ash timber, how much we leave it to develop and see what happens, and how much we take it out and use it. I would refer to more expertise here to comment on that.
Tom, this must be an issue that you're dealing with on your own estate, the Woodland Trust. So any thoughts on that point from the audience?
Yeah, certainly. So obviously there's the unrecognised benefit of the additional deadwood that's ash is producing across the landscape. So that's a really good feature that could be taken from a negative situation. And I would go back to this on-site production, generating higher value products from this timber, and that may be a change in manufacturing opportunities, perhaps finger jointing of lower grade timber. Where I get concerned is I know of contractors that are shipping ash logs out to Vietnam in shipping containers, and that just seems absurd to me. It should be about generating in-country added value products.
Okay, I'm going to... Yeah, lots of hands going up. I think this gentleman did have his hand up first earlier on.
Be curious to hear the panel's thoughts about the application of woodland products to soils on farms, and particularly as a diversification option with overstood, coppice rotations and that. Any options to engage farmers from that specific perspective?
Didn't quite catch the full the start of the
Sorry, it
question.
was about so soils on farms overstood rotations, production of wood chip, and that as a way into the farming community, as a way of showcasing what the woodlands can offer. Just any thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Yeah, well, I think definitely wood chip is a way to support some of those kind of initial interventions in woodland, because some of the material that you're going to be taking out is going to be quite low grade, but virtually anything can be chipped, and then obviously you can then think about it in that sort of wider cycling system. So I think Tom mentioned the opportunity of wood chip for bedding. You then do that for a few years, and you're basically building up a bit of compost, which you can then use to improve the soil health by spreading it on your land. And there probably are other opportunities as well. So Tim, do you done any work on that particular aspect, or any insights on that one?
I was probably going to make roughly the same points that you were, Clive. I'm certainly aware of farmers in Mid Wales doing quite a lot of work with wood chip and going through that process of using it for bedding and for compost. The whole point for me is that trees are integral to soil health. Having trees, the mycorrhizal associations generally are providing feed in to soil health generally, and that's my main selling point for trees, is the value they add to your soils. I think it's quite a complicated picture, actually. I mean, biochar is another thing to think about, but that's a can of worms, really, in terms of some of the values and opportunities and the work required around integrating and utilising that.
Tom or Ollie, do you want to add anything, or are you good with that one? Yeah, we're happy to talk about that one a bit more afterwards, maybe. There's a colleague I could introduce you to on the Soil Association stand who's written a whole book on wood chip, so come and see us later. I was going to take this lady next, and then I'm going to take two questions together, the two people over there. Thank you.
I just wanted to share with people our experience. We recently got funding via the PIES project, which was with the Silver Foundation. It was just one day of someone coming around the farm looking at all of our woodland, but it was a really, really good sort of kickstarter for us to understand what we had, what the opportunities were, and that funding is still open, and it's a really easy application process. So if people do have woodland that is unmanaged, I would really recommend that they go and have a look at that, because for us, we've realised how much there is to do. We kind of already knew that, but it has at least given us some direction.
Yeah. So that's more a comment and sort of an observation for anybody in the audience, but I'd just sort of expand on that a little bit. There are, credit to the Forestry Commission, they have had a few rounds now of their Woodlands Into Management Innovation Funding programme, and they've supported some really interesting projects, including that one from PIES. We've obviously heard from Tom about the support that you can get from the Woodland Trust as well. Tim?
Yeah, just quickly, I think in my head, management is measurement. I think the first stage to take is to start doing that inventory of your resource and having a look at what you've got. I mean, because if it's not something you've had a quick look at, they're often, depending on, and again, farm woodlands fall into a wide range of different categories and a wide range of different spaces, and it's the first step is to have a look at your resource base, and it's a really important place to start. So I think that's great.
Hello, I'm Maddie. I'm an anthropologist at the Society and Environment Research Group. Ollie, I was really interested in the case studies you're producing. We're doing something similar, and I think this stuff about kind of the lack of visibility, even though this stuff is there. So if any farmers in the room are doing this and would like to be in a case study and showcase to people what they're doing, please accost me at some point today. I'd love to talk to you. But my question to you is, why do you think there has and continues to maybe be this lack of visibility, and what do we do about that? I think these case studies are great, but is there anything else you think we really should be doing to make this more visible? And just as a really quick, the question somebody asked about ash dieback, I was at a stand yesterday at the Leaf stand over there, and they had a guide to farmers for ash dieback. I don't actually know what it fully includes, but perhaps go over to their stand. I was there yesterday and it looked great.
It's the Forestry Commission stand. Is it? No?
Hello everyone, I'm the Forest Research. I've been working with Leaf over there, the Department of Farming, and
The Leaf stand.
yeah,
Yeah. So people can't hear you, Bianca.
It came to our attention, farmers really wanted to cut through the confusion about ash dieback. So with Leaf, we've produced these. So go over to the stand, just over there in the corner,
Okay.
and help yourself.
Thank you. This is just the sort of joining up I was hoping that we would get from the audience. So thank you for these observations and comments. Ollie, do you want to specifically respond?
What do we do about the lack of understanding and wider sort of cultural awareness of some of these things? I mean, I guess the roots, Tim referred to it, they go back a good few decades now, and I think, and wider than that, there's been there's sort of disconnection in various places. There's a wider social disconnection from the land and ecological processes in this country, because most people live in urban areas and we've become disconnected for all sorts of different reasons. There's a disconnection between many farmers and the forest resource on their land, the tree resource. That's been encouraged by statutory bodies and reflected in wider sort of social patterns. So, what do we do about it? I mean, there's a lot of weight on the word we, isn't it? Who is the we? There's we in this room. We can all work, find together in ways that we can, that are within our power, to find relevant organisations, to work with the resources that we have, to be supportive of local businesses, to use local sawmills if we have them, to to do all sorts of things in our local area and within our networks. Wider than that, I think there's or within our professions, if you're within academia, to use that knowledge and that research to put pressure on the relevant authorities to do various things. So there's all sorts of things people can do. Wider than that, I think we also have to start looking at ways that we can make new connections and be a stronger movement of people who are trying to recreate these new economic systems and these new understandings. And that's not a simple thing, is it? I mean, that goes from children through education up through all sorts of things. So that's a lot of anthropology that I'm sure you're doing. I mean, I'd love to have more of this conversation. Hopefully people can be inspired by the opportunities. I think that's what we want. Clive referred to it earlier, and there's a lot about, okay, we're facing a lot of problems, but we've also got to be inspired by our opportunities and look really positively at what we've got. That there's no one answer, I would say. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Yeah, just while you hand the microphone over, I mean, that's why one of the reasons we wanted to run this session. I mean, we do have a very polarised approach, I think, in the UK to forestry, in terms of the forests that produce timber, and as Ollie said earlier, the forests that do conservation. And there's definitely an opportunity to break down that divide, and deal with some of these other paradoxes that we have, which is this big opportunity in terms of timber substitution and that big footprint that we have, and this big unmanaged resource. So we're trying to do our little bit in terms of profiling the opportunities around farm scale forestry, and challenge some of that orthodoxy, I think, that's out there.
Hi, yes. Earlier there was a comment about how a lot of trees are already stressed, drought and disease already, and we're at 1.2 degrees of global warming. And I suppose my question is, what level of confidence do you have about the approaches that you're recommending if we are heading towards 2 degrees, 2.5, 3 degrees warming? What confidence do you have that actually those trees will be resilient in the face of that?
I'm going to hand quickly over to Tim on that one, because I think Tim will have some insights on that. I mean, we haven't talked very much about the actual management of the woodland and the sort of diversification of the woodland, but that's clearly a key strategy, I think, to deal with some of the risks that you highlight. But Tim.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's pretty interesting. When you expose trees to high levels of carbon and heat stress, they do interesting things, and we do know that. We research in those areas. So at Bangor, we expose woodlands to high levels of CO2, and we measure what happens. What happens is interesting. They put a lot of their resource into the below ground activity. The mycorrhizal activity increases. They're scavenging nutrients from deeper in the soil and bringing those back up. Trees are, to a certain extent, good systems to deal with climate change. I mean, I work with farmers all over the world in very, very hot conditions, and of course they have trees that are can utilize and can handle that stress, and they are mechanisms to deal with that stress. I think that the problem for us now is that we are, we've got an issue around establishment. Trying to plant trees in these conditions is increasingly challenging, but having that resource there, and where trees are already established, they are, to a certain extent, I mean, notwithstanding increased exposure to pests, which we can also manage, they do have the tools and the capabilities to access deeper water and to access nutrients in ways that other plants can't do, and as a result, they are major adaptation features of our landscape in relation to this. These are our tools for dealing with the climate change, and that's how I sell trees to farmers all over the world. I think undoubtedly we're going to have stresses, and trees will be exposed to stresses, but I think trees will also adapt and work through that. And I think we need to be a little bit more open to other species, and maybe not be as so tied to certain types of species, and allow the as the climate windows change for certain species to be able to move across. There is and again with that comes opportunity. Walnut. Some of those species that currently don't thrive here will start to thrive here, and alongside that comes a whole opportunity for us to be able to utilise. So I think we talk about sustainability, but we need sustain agility, and it's a funny thing to talk about sustain agility with trees, but it's quite good that we could to start opening our minds, and I think that's again what we're trying to do here, is to try and think about ways that we can strengthen, build that resource into the future, and I 100% believe trees are key tools for adaptation against climate change here.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Well, I was going to... I saw 3 hands go up immediately then, so I can't really choose between the 3. Why don't we take all 3 questions and we'll try and deal with them together as a panel. So...
Yeah, thank you.
On the side of the room, yeah.
There's as we all know, a gathering momentum for farmer clusters around the country, which are beginning to work very well. What about farm woodland clusters within regions, where we can get a cooperative approach to equipment? Because I think one of the great barriers to managing woodlands on farm is the cost of the gear and finding the contractors with the gear. Whereas if you've got a cluster, you might well be able to fund equipment on a shared basis.
Yeah. I think we're just going to be supportive of that. I mean, we need to broaden out from our obsession with spending money on planting trees to support some of these other activities. That kind of wider management, that wider supply chain, otherwise we're going to end up with more of the same resource that we've got currently, unless we address that very point that you've made. So yes, we will. In a sort of policy context, we're definitely calling for support to encourage those clusters. And I think all the organisations represented here would be very supportive of that. So I'm going to move on quite quickly, so I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, sorry, I'll keep it brief, and if you just want to signpost me to some resources, and that's fine. But it's a question mainly about like carbon sequestration, really. So I've heard a lot of talk about the ability of grasslands to sequester a lot of carbon, and obviously it's well known that woodlands do that as well. And there's a lot of conflicting information out there to see which is best and which one can sequester the most. I guess I was just wondering if you've got any pointers towards that.
I don't think we've got time to... There's this whole session on woodlands and carbon, I think at 11 o'clock, which I'll be going to. So maybe we can hold some of those questions for then. Unless there's any brief responses. No, I don't think there are.
I would say there is a brief response. It's trees, but I mean, there's a big debate that would follow that, isn't there? So, which we haven't got time for. But but it's not one or the other. Like if you've only got 1 square meter, I would say plant a tree. Don't put down some ryegrass. But if you live in a mixed landscape, well, you're going to probably have both of them. So look at how to work with both of them in a constructive way. But I also just wanted to come back on the farm cluster thing. But if we hear the other question and then...
Yep.
It was also on clusters, and this is going to work better at a slightly bigger scale, both from management and supply chain and demand. So, yep.
Final comment to you then, Ollie, on clusters.
Well, it was only just you mentioned about sharing machinery, and the photo I showed of Dave at Middle Ruckham, like that wood miser there is a shared wood miser between 7 or 8 local foresters. They have a rent and share use of it. So they bought it together and they book themselves in to use the machine to take the time to process out the timber that they might occasionally be getting. So they can work with farmers, they can do it as a contract job, and I think that is definitely a way forward that a lot more people could be doing. I know of another case like that in Dorset where there's a group of people owning that machinery together because it's not used every day. It makes total sense. But wider than that, I think what those clusters hopefully will start also contributing to is local timber hubs where some of the all sorts of timber and tree products can start being sold and processed in one place, and customers can come and access the different kinds of things they need.
I'm being told to cut it off there, so I'm just going to end on some thank yous to the three speakers, Tim, Tom and Ollie. Thank you to all of you for your engagement and your questions. Final slide there is the plug for the Agroforestry Show, which is being jointly hosted by the Woodland Trust and Soil Association. We have this 10% off offer at the moment, so come and see us on our stand if you want to book a ticket. Thank you.